Admiral Marcus Thompson stood at the bustling airport terminal, his navy blue blazer neatly pressed and his leather bag slung over one shoulder. The weight of his years of service was evident in the way he carried himself, calm, composed, and confident. Today, however, was supposed to be a day off from the pressures of command. He had just finished a high-level meeting in Washington, D.C., and now he was heading home to San Diego for some much-needed rest. The flight wasn't anything special, a routine domestic trip on a commercial airline. As he approached the gate, Marcus couldn't help but notice the energy around him. Families with children were rushing to board early, business travelers were glued to their laptops, and a few tourists were snapping photos by the window. Everything seemed normal until his gaze landed on a woman standing near the front of the boarding line. She was impeccably dressed in designer clothes, her blonde hair styled perfectly. But something about her demeanor caught his attention. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, and she kept glancing back toward the growing crowd behind her, as if searching for someone or something. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. After all, airports were stressful places, and people often let their frustration show. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, who scanned it quickly and smiled politely before waving him through. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said warmly. Marcus nodded and stepped forward, ready to make his way down the jet bridge. That's when things took an unexpected turn. As he moved closer to the plane, the well-dressed woman turned around abruptly, blocking his path. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, taking in his appearance. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, without warning, she spoke. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the hum of chatter around them. "Are you sure you're in the right section? This is first class." Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't the question itself that surprised him. It was the tone. There was no curiosity or politeness in her voice, only accusation. Before he could respond, she continued, her words dripping with condescension. "I mean, I don't want to cause a scene, but these seats are reserved for premium passengers. Maybe you should double-check your ticket." A murmur rippled through the small group of nearby travelers who had overheard the exchange. Some shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others openly stared, unsure of what to say. Marcus felt the familiar sting of judgment, not because of anything he had done, but simply because of who he was. Over the years, he had faced similar moments countless times, each one chipping away at his patience. Yet here he was again, being questioned in a place where he had every right to be. Despite the tension, Marcus remained calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, holding it up so she could see it clearly. "Yes, Mom," he replied evenly, his deep voice steady and measured. "This is my seat." His tone left no room for argument, but the woman wasn't satisfied. Instead of backing down, she raised an eyebrow skeptically, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Well," she said, dragging out the word as if savoring the drama of the moment, "let's hope there hasn't been a mistake." With that, she turned on her heel and marched onto the plane, leaving Marcus standing there, surrounded by whispers and sideways glances. Little did anyone know, this encounter was only the beginning of a story that would soon unfold and reveal far more than anyone expected. As Admiral Marcus Thompson stepped onto the plane, the weight of the earlier interaction lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake off the dismissive look the woman had given him or the way she had questioned his presence in first class. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on his appearance, but it never failed to leave a bitter taste. Still, Marcus was no stranger to handling difficult situations with grace. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that this was just another moment, one he would navigate with dignity. The flight attendants greeted him warmly as he made his way down the narrow aisle, scanning for his assigned seat. First class was quieter than the rest of the cabin, with only a handful of passengers settling into their plush seats. Marcus found his spot by the window, stowed his bag overhead, and sat down. He glanced around, taking in the serene atmosphere. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax, hoping the rest of the journey would pass without incident. But then he heard it, the unmistakable click of heels approaching. The well-dressed woman from the gate appeared, her expression unchanged. She paused beside his row, her eyes narrowing as if confirming her suspicions. "Oh," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "so you're really sitting here?" Her tone carried a mix of disbelief and annoyance, as though she couldn't fathom why someone like him, a black man dressed simply yet neatly, would occupy such a premium seat. Marcus looked up at her, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely, meeting her gaze without flinching. "This is my seat." Her lips pressed into a thin line, clearly unsatisfied with his response. Rather than moving on, she planted herself firmly in the aisle, blocking his view and drawing even more attention. "Well," she continued, her voice dripping with skepticism, "I suppose we'll see how long you stay there." Her comment hung in the air, awkward and pointed, as other passengers began to notice the tension brewing. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle cleared his throat nervously, trying to diffuse the situation. "Everything okay here?" he asked hesitantly, glancing between Marcus and the woman. "Yes, everything's fine," Marcus answered smoothly before the woman could interject. His words were calm, but there was an underlying firmness that commanded respect. The man nodded slowly, sensing the subtext of the exchange, and returned to flipping through his magazine. Unsatisfied, the woman turned her attention to the flight attendant who was assisting passengers with their bags. "Excuse me," she called out, raising her hand as if summoning authority. The young attendant hurried over, her smile polite but slightly strained. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I need you to verify this man's ticket," the woman demanded, gesturing toward Marcus. "He says he's in first class, but I find it hard to believe. Just check to be sure, will you?" The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard by the request. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod. Without hesitation, she retrieved his boarding pass from the scanner at the front of the cabin and confirmed aloud, "Sir, your ticket is correct. You're in seat 3A, first class." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, but instead of apologizing, she crossed her arms defiantly. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with resentment. "Let's hope there aren't any mistakes later." With that, she slid into her own seat 2 rows ahead, still radiating hostility. The surrounding passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads subtly while others pretended not to notice. Marcus exhaled quietly, leaning back against his seat. He knew better than to let her behavior rattle him. It wasn't worth the energy. But the encounter left a sour note in what should have been a peaceful flight. Still, he reminded himself that people like her often revealed more about themselves than they realized. And sometimes, the best response wasn't confrontation but patience. After all, the truth had a way of speaking for itself. For now, Marcus chose to focus on the view outside the window, watching as ground crew members prepared the plane for departure. The engines roared to life, and the hum of activity filled the cabin. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Marcus felt a renewed sense of resolve. Whatever came next, he would handle it with the same strength and composure that had guided him throughout his career. This wasn't just a flight. It was another chapter in a story far bigger than one uncomfortable encounter. The plane rumbled down the runway, lifting smoothly into the sky. Passengers settled into their routines. Some opened laptops, others flipped through magazines, and a few closed their eyes, hoping to catch a nap. Admiral Marcus Thompson, however, found it hard to relax. The earlier confrontation with the woman still lingered in his mind, not because he was upset, but because it reminded him of how prejudice could seep into even the most mundane moments of life. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the woman sat 2 rows ahead. She hadn't looked back since taking her seat, but her presence loomed like an unspoken tension. Marcus shook his head slightly, dismissing the thought. He wasn't about to let someone else's behavior dictate his peace of mind. Instead, He reached for the book he brought along, a biography of a fellow naval officer, and tried to immerse himself in its pages. Just as he began to lose himself in the story, turbulence hit. The plane jolted sharply, causing drinks to spill and tray tables to rattle. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers gripped their armrests. For a brief moment, the atmosphere shifted from calm to chaos. Children cried out, and nervous whispers filled the air. Even the flight attendants paused mid-task, their usual composure faltering under the unexpected bumps. Amid the commotion, the woman in front turned abruptly, her face pale with anxiety. She scanned the cabin, perhaps seeking reassurance or guidance, but her eyes landed on Marcus instead. There was something different in her gaze this time, not hostility, but uncertainty. It was fleeting, though, and she quickly looked away, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence due to weather conditions ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." Despite the calm tone, the announcement did little to ease the growing unease among the passengers. A young mother nearby struggled to comfort her crying toddler while keeping her own fear in check. An elderly man in the row beside her clutched his cane, his knuckles white. Sensing the rising panic, Marcus instinctively unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward slightly. Though he wasn't officially on duty, decades of training had ingrained in him the importance of staying calm during emergencies. He caught the flight attendant's eye and gave a subtle nod, signaling that he was ready to assist if needed. Seeing his composed demeanor, the flight attendant approached him cautiously. "Sir," she whispered, leaning closer, "are you comfortable helping us manage the situation? We've got a few anxious passengers, and any support would be appreciated." Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he replied softly, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever I can." He stood up carefully, mindful of the turbulence, and moved toward the nervous mother and child. Kneeling beside them, he offered a warm smile. "It's going to be okay," he said gently. Turbulence can feel scary, but planes are built to handle it. "You're safe here." His words seemed to soothe the mother, who managed a weak smile in return. Turning his attention to the toddler, he added playfully, "Hey there, champ. Looks like we're riding a roller coaster today, huh?" The child giggled nervously, momentarily distracted from the chaos around them. Encouraged by the small victory, Marcus continued moving through the cabin, offering quiet reassurances to other passengers. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, his calm presence a balm to frayed nerves. Meanwhile, the woman who had challenged him earlier watched silently from her seat. Her earlier bravado seemed to have melted away, replaced by a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. As Marcus helped calm another passenger, a businessman gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white, she finally spoke up, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Thank you," she murmured, almost reluctantly, when he passed by her row. Marcus paused briefly, meeting her gaze with a polite nod. "You're welcome," he said simply, his tone neutral. There was no trace of resentment in his voice, only professionalism. As the turbulence subsided and the plane steadied, the cabin gradually returned to normal. Passengers exhaled in relief, some thanking the flight attendants while others resumed their activities. Marcus returned to his seat, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. In that moment, he realized something important. Sometimes, actions spoke louder than words, and whether or not anyone acknowledged it, his conduct had already begun to challenge the assumptions made about him earlier. With the turbulence easing and the plane gliding smoothly through the sky, a sense of calm settled over the cabin. Passengers who had been gripping their armrests moments earlier now relaxed visibly, some even laughing nervously about how intense the ride had been. The flight attendants resumed their duties, offering drinks and snacks with practiced efficiency. Admiral Marcus Thompson sank back into his seat, finally allowing himself to unwind. But as he reached for the bottled water on his tray table, he noticed something unusual. The woman who had questioned him earlier, Karen, as her name tag on her designer handbag revealed, was watching him intently. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. It was clear that she hadn't expected him to step up during the turbulence. In fact, judging by the way she kept glancing at him, it seemed like she was struggling to reconcile the image of the man she had judged with the one who had just helped calm an entire cabin. Marcus chose to ignore her gaze. He didn't owe her, or anyone, an explanation for his actions. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of clouds below. They stretched across the horizon like a sea of cotton, glowing softly in the sunlight. For a moment, he let himself appreciate the beauty of the scene, grateful for the quiet after the storm. Yet, despite his efforts to focus elsewhere, Karen's presence continued to nag at him, not because she mattered, but because her behavior reflected a deeper issue. Over the years, Marcus had encountered countless Karens, each convinced they knew better simply because of their biases. What frustrated him most wasn't their ignorance. It was the energy they wasted trying to diminish others instead of lifting themselves up. Still, he couldn't deny that their actions often left scars, no matter how much he tried to brush them off. As the minutes passed, Karen grew increasingly restless. She fidgeted with her phone, scrolled aimlessly through her emails, and adjusted her seatbelt multiple times. Finally, unable to contain herself, she leaned slightly toward the aisle, craning her neck to get a better look at Marcus. When their eyes met briefly, she hesitated, then cleared her throat awkwardly. Excuse me, she began, her voice softer than before. It lacked the sharp edge from earlier, replaced by an almost hesitant tone. I just wanted to say, you handled that situation really well. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden change in demeanor. Thank you, he replied evenly, keeping his response polite but distant. He wasn't interested in engaging further. Her words felt too little, too late. Karen pressed on, seemingly determined to justify herself. You know, I've flown first class plenty of times, and sometimes people try to sneak into seats they don't belong in. That's why I asked earlier. It wasn't personal or anything. Her attempt at explaining herself came off as clumsy and insincere, more like a justification than an apology. Marcus studied her for a moment, debating whether to respond. Then, deciding that silence might speak louder than any retort, he simply nodded and turned back to his book. He could feel her lingering gaze, heavy with unspoken thoughts, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of another reaction. If she wanted to make amends, it would take more than hollow words. The rest of the passengers seemed oblivious to the tension between them, content to enjoy the remainder of the flight. A businessman nearby struck up a conversation with his neighbor about stock prices, while a young couple laughed quietly over shared earbuds. Even the toddler who had cried during the turbulence was now fast asleep, curled up against his mother's side. For Marcus, the irony of the situation wasn't lost. Here he was, a decorated Navy admiral, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country. And yet, this woman had seen fit to question his worth based on nothing more than appearances. It was a reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice could be, lurking beneath the surface of everyday interactions. But rather than let it sour his mood, he chose to rise above it. After all, proving his value wasn't his responsibility, it was hers. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light through the windows, Marcus reminded himself of the bigger picture. Every challenge, every insult, and every act of resilience added another layer to his story. And while Karen might never fully understand the weight of what she had done, Marcus knew one thing for certain. The truth always found its way to the surface. All he had to do was wait. The flight had settled into a rhythm, the hum of the engines providing a soothing backdrop as passengers relaxed. Admiral Marcus Thompson leaned back in his seat, flipping through the pages of his book. The earlier turbulence and Karen's awkward attempt at an apology felt like distant memories now. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to truly unwind, letting the peaceful ambience of the cabin wash over him. But just as he was getting lost in the story, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his tone calm but serious, "we're experiencing some minor mechanical irregularities that require our attention. While there's no immediate danger, we need everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened until further notice." A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged worried glances, and a few groaned audibly. Mechanical issues were never welcome news, even if they turned out to be minor. The flight attendants sprang into action, double-checking that everyone was securely buckled in and offering reassurances. Karen, who had been scrolling absent-mindedly on her phone, froze mid-swipe. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrests, her earlier bravado replaced by visible anxiety. She glanced around nervously, clearly searching for someone, anyone, who might provide comfort or answers. Seeing the growing tension, one of the flight attendants made an announcement. "If anyone on board has emergency training or experience handling stressful situations, please let us know. Your assistance would be greatly appreciated." Marcus didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt and raised his hand slightly, catching the flight attendant's eye. "I can help," he said firmly, standing up despite the request to remain seated. His commanding presence immediately drew attention, not just from the crew, but also from nearby passengers. The flight attendant approached him quickly, relief evident on her face. "Sir, do you have any specific qualifications?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. "I'm a U.S. Navy Admiral with 30 years of service," Marcus replied calmly. "I've handled high-pressure situations my entire career. Tell me what you need." Her eyes widened slightly at the revelation, but there was no time for questions. She nodded gratefully and gestured for him to follow her toward the front of the plane, where the lead flight attendant and another crew member were consulting quietly. As Marcus moved past rows of curious passengers, whispers broke out. Some recognized his rank, while others simply marveled at the aura of authority he carried. At the front of the cabin, Marcus listened intently as the crew explained the situation. Though the issue wasn't life-threatening, it required clear communication and leadership to keep passengers calm and ensure safety protocols were followed. Drawing on decades of experience, Marcus offered practical advice, helping the crew organize their response and prioritize tasks. Meanwhile, Karen watched silently from her seat, her earlier skepticism replaced by something else. Awe, perhaps, or shame. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Marcus as he worked alongside the crew, issuing instructions and speaking reassuringly to nervous passengers. It was impossible to miss the respect he commanded, not only from the flight attendants, but also from everyone else on board. When Marcus returned to his seat after ensuring everything was under control, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Passengers whispered to each other, piecing together fragments of information about the man who had stepped up when things got tough. A businessman sitting across the aisle leaned over and said quietly, "Thank you, sir. Whatever your role is here today, we're lucky to have you." Marcus gave a small nod, brushing off the praise. "Just doing my part," he replied humbly. Karen, however, couldn't bring herself to look at him directly. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her mind racing. For the first time since boarding the plane, she seemed unsure, not of Marcus, but of herself. The man she had dismissed so casually hours earlier was proving to be far more than she had imagined. And as the reality of his character sank in, she realized that this flight wasn't just taking her to her destination. It was teaching her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. As the plane continued its journey, the initial panic began to subside. The flight crew, bolstered by Admiral Marcus Thompson's steady guidance, worked efficiently to reassure passengers and maintain order. Passengers who had been gripping their armrests moments earlier now relaxed slightly, some even striking up quiet conversations with their neighbors. It was clear that the situation, while unsettling, was under control, and much of that credit went to Marcus. Once he was confident the cabin was stable, Marcus returned to his seat, settling back in with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He wasn't one to seek recognition, but he knew that stepping up in moments like these mattered. Leadership wasn't about titles or uniforms. It was about action, especially when others needed it most. Still, he didn't expect what came next. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom once again, this time warmer and more personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for your patience during this unexpected situation. We're happy to report that everything is proceeding as planned, and we'll be landing on schedule. Before we wrap up, I'd also like to extend a special thanks to one of our passengers today, a true leader who stepped forward to assist us when we needed it most." Marcus stiffened slightly in his seat, sensing where this was headed. Sure enough, the pilot continued, "Admiral Marcus Thompson, a decorated U.S. Navy officer, has been instrumental in helping our team manage this situation. His experience and calm demeanor made all the difference, and we are deeply grateful for his presence on board." A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin as heads turned toward Marcus. Some passengers clapped instinctively, while others stared in awe, piecing together the significance of his role. The businessman across the aisle gave him a thumbs up, grinning widely. Even the toddler who had cried during the turbulence earlier peeked over her mother's shoulder, pointing at Marcus as if recognizing him as a hero. Karen, seated 2 rows ahead, froze. Her face flushed red as the weight of her earlier behavior crashed down on her. Here she was, sitting mere feet away from a man who had not only proven himself capable, but had done so with humility and grace. The same man she had questioned and insulted just hours ago was now being celebrated by everyone around her. She sank lower into her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, particularly Marcus. For his part, Marcus remained composed, though he couldn't help but feel a twinge of irony. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but now that it had found him, he decided to use the moment wisely. Leaning forward slightly, he addressed the passengers nearest to him in a calm, measured tone. "Thank you all for your kindness," he said, his deep voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around him. "I'm honored to serve, whether it's in uniform or simply as a fellow traveler. Today reminded me how important it is to look out for one another, no matter where we are." His words resonated deeply with those who heard them. A young woman seated beside him nodded thoughtfully, whispering, "That's something we should all remember." Others echoed her sentiment, nodding in agreement. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted yet again, not just because of the mechanical issue resolved, but because Marcus's actions had sparked a shared sense of reflection. Karen, however, couldn't escape the growing weight of her guilt. As the applause died down and passengers resumed their activities, she fidgeted nervously with her purse strap, unable to focus on anything else. Every glance at Marcus felt like a reminder of her own poor judgment. What must he think of her? Did he see her as petty and small-minded? Worse still, did everyone else? Her internal turmoil reached a breaking point when the flight attendant stopped by her row to check on her. "How are you holding up, Mom?" the attendant asked kindly. I'm fine," Karen stammered, forcing a smile. But as the attendant moved on, Karen's resolve crumbled. She glanced back at Marcus one last time, her lips trembling as she whispered under her breath, "I was wrong about you." Though Marcus couldn't hear her, the sentiment hung heavy in the air. Whether Karen realized it or not, this flight had become more than just a journey. It was a reckoning. For Marcus, it was proof that dignity and integrity always prevailed. And for Karen, it was a lesson she would carry long after the plane touched down. Assumptions could blind us to the truth, but courage and character had a way of shining through, no matter the circumstances. The plane descended smoothly toward San Diego, its wheels kissing the runway with a gentle thud. As the engines powered down and the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to disembark. The earlier tension had melted away, replaced by a collective sense of relief. And for many, admiration for Admiral Marcus Thompson. Marcus moved deliberately, taking his time to collect his things from the overhead compartment. He wasn't in a rush. Years of military discipline had taught him the value of patience. Besides, he knew that once he stepped off the plane, life would return to its usual rhythm. For now, though, he allowed himself to savor the quiet satisfaction of having made a difference, however small. Karen, on the other hand, was anything but calm. She fumbled with her bag, her hands trembling as she zipped and unzipped compartments unnecessarily. Her mind raced with thoughts of what awaited her outside the plane. Would people recognize her? Had anyone recorded her behavior earlier? And more importantly, how could she possibly face Marcus after everything that had happened? As the line of passengers shuffled toward the exit, Karen found herself standing just behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last, her guilt pressing down on her like a weight. When they finally reached the door, the flight attendant greeted Marcus warmly. "Thank you again, Admiral," she said sincerely, shaking his hand. "We're so grateful for your help." Marcus smiled modestly. "Just doing my duty," he replied before stepping out onto the jet bridge. Karen hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. Summoning what little courage she had left, she called out softly, "Admiral Thompson." Marcus turned, his expression neutral but attentive. "Yes, Mom," he asked politely, though there was a hint of curiosity in his tone. Karen swallowed hard, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "For earlier, I was wrong about you, about everything." Her apology hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Other passengers slowed their pace, watching the exchange with interest. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged knowing glances. Clearly, word of her earlier behavior and Marcus's subsequent heroics had spread. Marcus studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "I appreciate your apology." Karen blinked, caught off guard by his response. She had expected anger or dismissal, not understanding. "Thank you," she murmured, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what else to say." "There's no need to say anything more," Marcus replied gently. "What matters is what we do moving forward. We all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that defines us." His words struck a chord not only with Karen but also with those listening nearby. A young man waiting to disembark nodded thoughtfully, muttering under his breath, "That's true wisdom right there." Others echoed similar sentiments, their respect for Marcus growing even deeper. Despite his forgiveness, Karen couldn't shake the shame that clung to her. As Marcus walked away, she lingered in the jet bridge, her shoulders slumped. Passengers streamed past her, some offering sympathetic looks, while others avoided her altogether. One woman stopped briefly to say, "Don't be too hard on yourself. Everyone deserves a second chance." Though meant to comfort, the comment only deepened Karen's unease. By the time she reached the terminal, whispers followed her wherever she went. A teenager filming a TikTok video captured her red-faced expression without her noticing, captioning it later as, "Karma catches up." Within hours, screenshots of the footage would circulate online, sparking debates about privilege and prejudice. But none of that mattered to Karen in that moment. All she could think about was the man who had shown her grace when she least deserved it. Admiral Marcus Thompson hadn't raised his voice or demanded an apology. He had simply led by example, proving that dignity was more powerful than disdain. As she disappeared into the crowd, dragging her suitcase behind her, Karen resolved to reflect on the lessons of the day. Whether she liked it or not, this flight had changed her, and perhaps in some small way, the world around her. By the time Admiral Marcus Thompson reached the baggage claim area, the events of the flight were already becoming a distant memory for him. He had moved on, as he always did, focusing instead on the tasks ahead, reuniting with his family, catching up on work emails, and perhaps enjoying a quiet evening at home. But for everyone else involved, the story was far from over. As passengers filtered into the terminal, phones buzzed with notifications. Someone had recorded the pilot's announcement about Marcus's role during the turbulence and shared it online. The video quickly went viral, capturing headlines across social media platforms. Viewers marveled at the irony. A decorated Navy admiral being questioned about his seat in first class only to later save the day. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage over Karen's behavior to admiration for Marcus's composure and leadership. Karen, meanwhile, became an unwitting symbol of privilege and prejudice. Footage of her awkward apology in the jet bridge spread like wildfire, accompanied by memes and hashtags like #CarmaineFirstClass. Critics dissected her actions, calling her out for stereotyping and entitlement. While some defended her belated apology as proof of growth, others dismissed it as too little, too late. For better or worse, she had become part of a national conversation about bias and accountability. Back in San Diego, Marcus remained blissfully unaware of the internet storm brewing around him. When his teenage granddaughter greeted him at the airport with a hug, she teased, "Grandpa, are you secretly famous now?" Holding up her phone, she showed him the viral posts and videos. At first, Marcus chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. "It seems people have nothing better to do than talk about me," he joked lightly. But as he scrolled through the comments, something shifted in his expression. Beyond the jokes and outrage, there were heartfelt messages from strangers thanking him for his service, not just to his country, but to humanity. Many shared their own stories of facing discrimination and expressed gratitude for seeing someone rise above it with dignity. One comment stood out. "Admiral Thompson didn't just handle turbulence in the air. He handled the turbulence of ignorance with grace." Moved by these words, Marcus realized that this incident wasn't just about him. It was bigger than any one person. It was a reminder of the power of leading by example, even in the smallest moments. Deciding to use the platform fate had handed him, he agreed to sit down for interviews with local news outlets. In each appearance, he spoke not of revenge or resentment, but of hope and resilience. "Prejudice is a burden we all carry in some way," he said during one interview. "But every act of kindness, no matter how small, chips away at it. My goal is to leave the world lighter than I found it." His message resonated deeply, sparking conversations about systemic racism and everyday biases. Schools invited him to speak to students about leadership and empathy, while community organizations used his story to advocate for greater inclusivity. Marcus embraced the opportunity, knowing that change often started with uncomfortable truths. As for Karen, she faded from public view almost as quickly as she had entered it. Reports surfaced that she had deleted her social media accounts and retreated from the spotlight. Whether she truly reflected on her actions or simply sought escape remained unclear. What mattered was that her behavior had ignited a dialogue, one that wouldn't be silenced anytime soon. In the end, the flight became more than just a journey between two cities. It was a lesson wrapped in turbulence, a story of assumptions challenged and lessons learned. And though Marcus never sought recognition, he embodied the very qualities society needed most: patience, humility, and unwavering strength. As he walked away from the cameras and microphones, ready to return to his quiet life, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the simplest acts of integrity could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone might imagine.